Hello, and welcome to the third part in our HIPAA series of webinars on HIPAA review and breach notification. My name is Stacy Larson, and I'm very happy to be here presenting for you today. We're going to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. So first, my disclosures and conflict of interest. I declare I do not have any financial or other relationships with the manufacturers of any commercial services discussed in this educational activity. And so our learning objectives for today, objective 1, to identify some potential areas of that impermissible use or disclosure of PHI that would trigger needing to make a breach. And then objective 2, describing those steps that you need to take when assessing for breach and making a breach notification to patients or others. So I thought, because this is the third in our series, that it would be helpful to do a bit of a HIPAA review before we get started, just because I think breach notification follows upon the HIPAA, the other two HIPAA rules, the privacy rule, the security rule. So I wanted to give a little overview just to bring us all back to kind of to start and then go from there. So first, as you all know or potentially are learning today, covered entities and providers would generally trigger HIPAA when they electronically transmit protected health information in connection with insurance claims or other third-party reimbursement. So this could be billing insurance, making benefit inquiries on behalf of a patient. Those electronic transmissions are kind of transmitting information via email to cloud storage from a mobile device or using Wi-Fi networks. Some providers still use paper faxes. That's not considered an electronic transmission, but a computer-generated fax would be. And then just a little bit more about insurance information. When I'm talking about that is billing documents, sending information to or emails to insurance companies, making transactions on an insurance company website. All of those things could potentially trigger HIPAA. Electronic submissions of protected health information not related to those transactions would not trigger HIPAA. So for instance, if you are emailing records to another psychologist for a consultation, that's not going to trigger HIPAA. But if someone acting on your behalf, so you hire a third-party billing service, and they are electronically submitting protected health information in conjunction with an insurance claim, that action would trigger HIPAA and compliance with the privacy rule. And once triggered, HIPAA applies to all of the potential protected health information in your practice, not just to the information in electronic form and not just the professional services that triggered the rule. Another aspect of HIPAA in general is the idea of business associates. So we talked about those third parties. So a business associate is an individual or entity that a provider may hire to assist with business operations, such as claims processing, billing, data analysis, storage of protected health information. So this would be if you've hired that third party to help bill insurance, or a third party to store documents, to dictate your notes. I know that that's a very old school, but some people still do that. When that comes in, you're going to want to get a business associate agreement, which we did talk about a little in our previous ones. And that's just an agreement that the business associate that you've hired, this individual, will follow HIPAA rules as well as you. And if there are any notifications or breaches or anything like that happen on the business associate side, they will notify you to make sure that you can notify your patients. And again, after triggering HIPAA, covered entities must comply with the privacy, security, and breach notification rules. So just a brief review of the privacy rule. So the privacy rule was written to ensure that individual health information is properly protected while still allowing the flow of health information. It applies to providers, health plans or insurers, and clearinghouses, which is kind of an older school thing, a storage house, basically, all considered covered entities, as well as those business associates, which I had talked about. The privacy rule sets those minimum standards related to disclosures of patient information, so to third parties. So it says when you can disclose, or the business associate can disclose patient information, what types of consent or authorization are needed to disclose protected information, and from whom. Is it from the patient? Is it from a healthcare proxy? Is it from some other surrogate? Conditions when no consent is required to disclose patient information, and how much protected health information is appropriate to disclose. So when I talk about that type of consent and authorization needed, like I said, it could be anytime information is going to a third party or for purposes outside of the healthcare of your practice, the healthcare operations of your practice. So you wouldn't necessarily need a consent or an authorization to share information with a provider in your practice. But if you're sharing with a provider, let's say your patient asks you to send information to a third party endocrinologist that is not somebody you're related to, you would need to get that consent or authorization to share that information. Anytime it's going to an outside third party. Those conditions where no consent is required, as providers, many of you are probably going to be aware of those, which are like instances where the patient is claiming harm to self or harm to others, instances where as a mandated reporter, you need to report abuse or neglect, elder abuse, financial abuse, depending on the state. And those are going to be very dependent on your state. You're going to want to be aware of what your state law says about those instances where you are a mandated reporter. And when I'm talking about how much protected health information is appropriate to disclose, the HIPAA rule is very clear that they want the minimum necessary. And so that is the minimum necessary. Basically, it's pretty clear. For instance, if they say we want the records for the last 6 months, only release the records for the last 6 months. They're not asking for above that. You want to give the minimum necessary. You want to give them the basic information that will answer the question or fulfill the request. But you don't need to give them more than that. And so the privacy rule, some of the things it gives patients the right to is receive a notice as to how and when protected health information may be disclosed, ways to access their health information, and amending their records. So when I talk about receiving notice as to how and when, you're going to want to give your patients informed consent that the healthcare team, consultation, billing purposes, those are all reasons that you might disclose protected health information. Instances outside of that, and the mandated reporting, but instances outside of that, you'd want to inform the patient for those ones you would need a release of information or you would get an authorization. Patients are able to access their health information with certain limitations. You're going to want to check your state law on this. Some states allow access to all records. Some states will exclude psychotherapy or what they call process notes. Testing data is treated differently in different states. This means the raw testing data, the raw materials, not necessarily the summary report or the testing report. And the testing data is often granted additional protections because there are copyright laws and other things in different states that would protect the sort of test questions, but maybe not the respondent's answers. So you're going to want to look at your state law for that, or consult with somebody in your state or the consultants at the trust. And amending the records. The pertinent word here is amending, not changing. And I've gotten this question a couple of times, like, what's the difference? To me, amending means that they can update, they can add, but they can't take away. They can't change it. So for instance, if you had put a diagnosis and you realized it was an incorrect diagnosis, or the patient disputes that diagnosis, it might be a function of adding a note saying patient disagrees with this diagnosis, patient does this, or if it was an error in a typo that you had done, you wrote the wrong code or anything like that, maybe putting one strike through initials and then kind of alerting to the new information. It's amending because you can still see what the old information is, not changing, because you're not taking out the old information and putting in new. And patients can submit amendments to their records, and that can happen. Usually it's a good idea to have that done in a consultation or discussion with their provider for reasons and to get a sense of that, but it can be done as part of the process. And so next, I want to kind of do a brief review of the security rule, which outlines the steps providers must take to protect confidential information from disclosures through breaches of security. It applies only to that electronic protected health information, which is received, created, or stored. Now, both HIPAA privacy rule and security rules are triggered when a healthcare provider transmits health information in electronic form. The security rule covers the information that is kept in electronic form, while as the privacy rule covers protected health information in all forms. So that's why I'm saying that the security rule kind of, when they're talking about that, it's the electronic PHI, which is received, created, or stored electronically. So a major goal of that security rule is to protect the privacy of individuals' health information while allowing covered entities to adopt new technologies to improve the quality and efficiency of patient care. It's designed to be flexible and scalable so that a smaller covered entity could implement policies, procedures, and technologies that are appropriate to that entity's size, the same as a hospital may want to entertain opportunities or policies that are a little bit more broad reaching because they have a larger patient base, more money, et cetera. And you're also going to want to consider the risks to the consumer's electronic health, protected health information in those different settings. So as part of the security rule, providers must conduct a risk assessment of all potential risks and vulnerabilities in the practice. This could be email, this could involve storage of your records, this could involve training of staff. That evaluation is going to tell you the likelihood and impact of potential risks. So maybe it is a function of our laptops are outdated and maybe we need to update our operating systems, or that it's not a good idea for every staff member to have a laptop. Maybe it's a matter of checking them out and things like that. It's kind of that areas where there might be a risk. And then the risk assessment helps you decide the areas to implement appropriate security measures to address those risks identified in the risk analysis, as well as documenting the chosen security measures and the rationale for adopting or not adopting measures. So one measure that we sometimes see is encryption of emails or encryption of data. So if you choose to go with a third party to help encrypt your information, then you would want to document why you went with that. If you choose not to go with encryption, it might be documenting why you didn't and the rationale for not adopting. So it's kind of both ways. And then the kind of maintenance of the continuous and reasonable and appropriate security protections. So basically what we're saying there is, based on the risk assessment, you're going to select those security measures to implement and meet them. And then you're going to maintain those ones. You're going to implement those security measures, document them in a written security plan, and kind of check back on that on a regular basis. You're going to want to update it as needed, as technology changes, as your practice changes. You're going to want to kind of keep referring back to that. So now we're on to the breach notification rule. So as I mentioned, I wanted to review the privacy and security rules because I think it's important to have that refresher to provide some more context for the breach notification rule. So the privacy rule governs all PHI, how it's protected and flows with patient authorizations. The security rule governs how ePHI, electronic protected health information, must be protected from security breaches. And then the breach notification rule tells providers when patients and HHS need to be notified in the event of a breach of protected health information. So a breach can occur when unsecured patient information has been improperly accessed or released in a way that violates the privacy rule and that compromises the privacy and security of that information. This can happen by accidentally sending patient information to the wrong place, computer is getting hacked by a third party, an unauthorized coworker accessing patient files. When that information is improperly accessed, the breach notification rule engages to determine next steps for that notification. So the rule defines a breach as the acquisition, use, or disclosure of protected information that violates the HIPAA privacy rule involving PHI that has not been secured by approved encryption or other technologies that make it unusable to unauthorized users, and that compromises the security or privacy of that protected health information by posing a significant risk of financial, reputational, or other harm to the patient. So basically what they're saying is somehow that protected health information got out, was read by another person, and there's a potential for that patient's identity to be stolen or for that patient to be harmed in some way. It used to be that this was done a lot, like because people were putting social security numbers in patient records. I think a lot of people have moved away from that. If you're still doing that, I suggest trying to find another way to manage that. Because there was this idea that If they had a name and a social security number, it was really easy to steal an identity. So while this is not something that happens commonly, I think that's kind of one of the more concrete places that I think people can come see how a protected health information could potentially pose a significant risk of financial harm to a patient or other harm to a patient. So I want to talk about unsecured versus secured protected health information, because we mentioned that's a big component of the breach notification rule. So unsecured PHI is that information that can be read or used by unauthorized individuals, and a breach of that unsecured PHI will always require breach notification. So for instance, if you have a paper file that is stolen, or you save your client files in an unencrypted Word document on your computer, which later gets stolen or hacked, that's going to be theoretically unsecured PHI information that would require potentially a breach notification. So secure protected health information is information that is made unreadable or indecipherable through different means. These means could be electronic PHI that has been encrypted. Generally, that involves a key that you are given, sort of like this long digit span of letters and numbers, and then ensuring that key is what unlocks the documents in your computer so that you can read them. So you want to make sure that that key is never used or never saved in the same place with the data. But the electronic protected health information that has been encrypted, it's an algorithmic process to transform that data into a form in which there is a low probability of assigning any meaning to the data without the use of that confidential process. So for instance, encryption could change it so that if you are reading it with the key that kind of tells your computer how to read it, it reads like Joe was in therapy today. Somebody who tries to read it who doesn't have the key would see a series of letters or numbers, symbols. It would not make it not readable, nothing that they could make any meaning of. So obviously, to avoid a breach of that confidential process, the decryption tools, that key that you get with your program, should be kept or stored differently or stored in a different place or at a location separate. You wouldn't want to keep the patient file and the encryption key in the same document. Another secure PHI information can be made unreadable through the way it's destroyed. So media on which it's recorded, if you can verify that it's been destroyed, it's going to be unreadable. So shredding paper and hard copy media, destroying it so that it cannot be read or reconstructed in some way. This might not be using a black marker. Sometimes people can hold it up to light and see. So shredding it or destroying it in some way that it just cannot be read. And then with electronic media, the same thing. It's sort of like wiping that media, purging it, drilling a hole through a hard drive if you have to make sure that if that media is no longer being used, is no longer something that's in your practice, that it cannot somehow go to another person who opens it up and is like, how did I get these patient records? So any independent practitioner, small group practice, or organization will need to consider the following when thinking of encryption. So you want to identify your practice needs. Which devices would need encryption? For example, is it just personal devices or just business computers or laptops, cell phones, tablets? Good rule of thumb is to encrypt those devices that you utilize in your practice and that may have the potential to have electronic protected health information on them. If you have a group practice or employ staff, another question to ask is who should be an authorized user able to access the ePHI? Do all your employees or clinicians need access to different levels of information, same information? So does the receptionist or the first person that the people see when people come in need access to the full client record, or only the schedule file, or only the calendar file? Thinking about the types of encryption, there are multiple types of technology that can be used concurrently to protect different threats. You may want to use full disk encryption to protect against data loss due to a computer crash, or virtual or file encryption to provide additional protection for client information that is more sensitive. That's a little outside of the scope of this one, but if people have questions about that, please feel free to send those in, and I can try to kind of talk to you a little bit about the different types of encryption, whether it's full disk, virtual disk, file. And then doing your research. Look into different encryption software vendors and ask questions. Often a simple online search using Google or Bing can identify several products that may be suitable for your practice, but then it's in your best interest to research those companies by reviewing the websites, contacting customer service to ask questions. It's in the company's best interest to make sure you understand the product and how well it is suited to your practice. They're generally not going to want to sell you a product that you're not going to be happy with, because then you get bad reviews. It's sort of like a give and take relationship, and always in considering the cost. There are a lot of options out there, ranging in price from free to several $100s. Just because it's free doesn't mean it's a bad product, but you may wish to compare a free option to a product available for purchase. You're going to want to choose the encryption that is best suited to your practice, not necessarily the most expensive option. So now we're kind of getting into the meat of things. So what if you have a breach? So covered entities and business associates must only provide the required notifications if the breach involved unsecured protected health information. As we mentioned, that unsecured protected health information is protected health information that has not been rendered unusable, unreadable, or indecipherable. So you must give a breach notification to patients and HHS unless you can demonstrate a low probability that that PHI has been compromised. For instance, the best case that we can kind of point to again is you probably don't have to give a notification if the PHI was encrypted and there's no way that whoever got that information would be able to read it. If you do suspect a breach, you must conduct a risk assessment to determine whether breach notification is necessary. So it can be difficult for clinicians to determine if there has been a breach. I'm going to kind of go through the risk assessment breach notification process here, but unless it's obvious that there's been a breach, like a provider calls you and says, you accidentally sent me records, or that your records were stolen, it's always wise to consult with the trust, an attorney in your state, or a seasoned colleague to help figure things out. I really think consultation is a very important part of the process. So providers, as part of this risk assessment that Department of Health and Human Services and Office of Civil Rights have kind of set up, they should assess 4 factors. So what was the nature and extent of the breached PHI? So you lose your smartphone. There's nothing about your contacts that indicate they are patients, not family, friends, coworkers. There's nothing about your smartphone that even indicates that you are a provider. So, the question is that PHI really PHI at that instance? Protected health information needs to be able to show you that the person is a patient, that they, et cetera, to be sort of covered by HIPAA. And if it's just their contacts and nothing says that they are a patient, then there's a question of, how serious that is. Now, if they steal your laptop and your laptop has all of your client records with all of their contact information and billing information and everything, that nature and extent, that's a little bit broader extent and breach of protected health information. The next question to consider: to whom may the protected health information been improperly disclosed? So was it to a thief? Somebody stole your laptop. Another practitioner, you accidentally sent them the wrong file, or they accidentally accessed a file that they shouldn't have. Another patient, you sent the information to Jane Doe versus Joe Doe. Was the PHI viewed, the protected health information viewed? Office is broken into and a locked file cabinet is pried open, but nothing disturbed? Maybe not. It could have been somebody who was just breaking into a building looking for money. Office broken into, file cabinet pried open, and 2 client files taken. Then there's a pretty good potential that the PHI has been viewed in that instance. Same with electronic files. Somebody hacks into your computer and takes those files. If they're not encrypted, there's a pretty good chance that the protected health information would have been viewed. And then the 4th factor to assess is, has the risk been mitigated by an unauthorized recipient? So as I mentioned, kind of accidentally sending a file to another provider. Can you shoot that person a phone call or an email and request that they delete the file and ask them to provide you confirmation of doing so? Then that might mitigate that risk in that instance, right? But if it's a thief who steals a laptop, you have no way of knowing if the risk is mitigated. There's no one to contact. There's no real way to kind of deal with that. So that risk is going to be greater, right, if it's stolen. So Determining whether to give that breach notification, like I said, you have to look at those 4 factors. And if they show a low probability that the PHI was improperly viewed, no breach notification is necessary. However, if you don't find that low probability, you must make a notification. If you're unsure, I would recommend going ahead and making that notification. Regardless of what you decide to make notice or not, you have to document your risk assessment of any potential breaches. So this is very important to do if you decide you don't need to give notice. As a protective measure for future investigations. For instance, if you are audited at some point, and I don't need to use the scary word audit, but if you were audited at some point by HHS and they're looking back and they're like, hey, wait, we see you did a breach or you had a breach and you decided not to give a notification, but you didn't document your risk assessment. You know, they might ask you more questions about that. That might lead to some sort of talking to from HHS, but it's definitely very important. Document everything you do when it comes to HIPAA, just as a protective measure for yourself and your patients. And you're going to want to reassess those privacy and security practices anytime there is a potential breach to prevent the same lapse from happening again. So, you know, Jane Doe and Joe Doe, you accidentally send the wrong client record. You're going to want to say, okay, how can I fix this in the past, maybe, or the next time? Maybe it's, I need to double check the name 3 times before I send, or things like that. It could be as simple as that. All HIPAA related documentation should be maintained for 6 years. So you're going to want to keep all information related to any breaches, risk assessments, that security assessment under the security rule. You're going to want to keep all of that information for that time period. I recommend, it's sometimes helpful to open like on your computer, set up a HIPAA breach investigation file. If you have breaches, where you kind of can aggregate all that data relevant to any potential breaches and investigations of your practice that you've done. It's just a kind of easy way to make sure that it's easily found and accessible if anything does happen. Should you have another breach, or should HHS come knocking and just want to do a, you know, routine audit, not that they necessarily do those too often, but we're seeing that more and more, that they're just checking up on people. So after conducting the breach risk assessment, what's next? So you need to determine how quickly you need to send a notice. So you must notify without unreasonable delay, sorry. So that's a maximum of 60 days of discovery of the breach. And you need to kind of prepare the notice and determine how to send notice to patients. So preparing the notice, it's kind of a brief description of the breach. Maybe it might be that my office was broken into and some client files were stolen, or my computer was hacked, etc. And including the date, if you can determine it. Sometimes you're not going to be sure, but if you can't determine a specific date, maybe a date range. Description of the unencrypted PHI involved. Like, remember I said earlier, if the information is encrypted, that will protect you from having to make a breach notification. Nobody can read it. It's not viewable. It's not meaningful. They can't understand what they're looking at. So PHI, the chances of PHI being viewed or misused in those instances is limited. But so if it's unencrypted, description of that PHI that's involved, the steps the patient should take against potential harm. They might want to notify their credit bureaus. They might want to reach out to their bank. They might want to reach out to their insurance company, different things, and which might be dependent upon the sort of information that was in the protected health information that was taken, which is why you want to give them that description. A description of the steps you have taken. You're fixing you've done the breach notification. You are updating your security things. I've seen some hospitals, when they have the really big breaches, providing credit reporting services. So this is going to really depend on the breadth, the depth of the breach, and kind of the repercussions it might have down the road. And then contact info for yourself, whether that be email, phone call, office address, etc. I would recommend putting as much contact information on there as possible so that patients who get this notice are able to easily contact you to ask any questions. And then determining how to send the notice to patients. You're going to provide that written notice by mail, or contact the patients by email if they've indicated that that is a preferred method of contact. A couple of questions outside of this. So what if the breach involves the protected health information of a minor, or an incapacitated patient, or a deceased patient? So where the breach involves the protected health information of minors or any of those others, deceased individuals or incapacitated patients, you may send the notice to their personal representative. So it might be a parent, a guardian, a healthcare proxy, the executor of the deceased patient's estate. If the patient is deceased and you have the address of his or her next of kin or personal representative, you must send notice by first class mail to either the next kin or the personal representative, because it's a little bit, you have to send notice to anybody, but it's a little bit different if the patient is deceased, right? Because it's a different sort of process on that side. If you have inadequate, or what if you have inadequate contact information to send notice to a patient. So maybe it was a patient you had 3 years ago, you don't have their full address anymore, or it's out of date, you know that that patient moved to another state, that's why they stopped seeing you. And if you have, so there's a couple of processes to kind of cure that. If you have that insufficient or out of date contact information that prevents you from providing a mail or email notice to the patient, and you have less than 10 patients impacted with the issue. So 10 patients are impacted by this breach. You can provide substitute notice by phoning the patient or other means reasonably likely to reach that patient. However, if you have more than 10 patients for whom you have insufficient data or can't contact information, you must give a type of substitute notice. Maybe conspicuously posting the notice on the homepage of your website or in major print or broadcast media in the area where the patients reside, putting an ad in the newspaper, putting an ad on the news. You must also list a toll-free number that will remain active for 90 days. So patients can call to see if the breach affected their PHI. Another question I get on breach notification: should I contact my professional liability carrier? While it's not required by the rule, it may be advisable to contact your professional liability insurer for risk management advice about any breaches, especially if the breach involves a large number of patients or was arguably the result of failing to follow good privacy and security practices to determine next steps. So in order to submit a notice of breach, there is a website. I will make sure that this is included. I realize it's not on this slide and I probably should have, but it's at hhs.gov. And there is a website that you can go to input the information for breach notification. So if the breach impacts less than 500 patients, keep a log of any breaches that happened during the year and notify the Department of Health and Human Services within 60 days of the end of the year. So that would be the end of February for the previous year. If it's a breach of 500 or more patients, immediate notice to Department of Health and Human Services, and you must send notifications to major media outlets in your area. So they differ, those obligations differ based on the breach affecting more or less than 500 individuals. If the number of individuals is affected by a breach is uncertain at the time of the submission, you're not quite sure how large the breach was, you should provide an estimate. And if you discover additional information, submit updates to Department of Health and Human Services in the manner specified. So if only one option is available in a particular submission category, the covered entity should pick the best option and may provide additional details in the free text portion of the submission. So when you look at the form, like I could not provide screenshots of the form, but when you look at the form, there's going to be free text boxes, picking the best option from the drop-down menus, and then adding additional context in those text portions. If you discover additional information that supplements, modifies, clarifies a previously submitted notice to the secretary, you can submit an additional form by checking the appropriate box to indicate that it is an addendum to the initial report. So you're not required, as I mentioned, for those breaches less than 500 patients, you're not required to wait until the end of the calendar year to report those breaches affecting fewer than 500 individuals. A covered entity may report those breaches at the same time as they're discovered. You might want to report all 500, or sorry, all breaches fewer than 500 individuals on one date, but it needs to be a separate notice. So let's say you had two separate breaches, one impacted 5 patients, the other one 25 patients, they were 6 months apart, totally separate. Even if you are choosing to upload those on the same date, say at the near the end of February 2023, you're going to want to do a separate notice for each breach incident. as I mentioned, in those breaches of unsecured protected health information that affects 500 or more individuals, the covered entity must notify the secretary without delay and never less than 60 days from the discovery of the breach. And regardless of what you decide to make notice or not, you have to document your risk assessment of any potential breaches. I cannot say this enough. I know I keep harping on it, but it's very important to do if you decide you don't need to give notice as a protective measure for those future investigations, or if you have a breach in the future. And anytime you have those breaches, reassessing the privacy and security practices of your facility, of your group practice, of your individual practice, to prevent the same lapse from happening again. So there are some exceptions to the definition of breach. So not every unauthorized improper disclosure is going to constitute a HIPAA breach. For instance, the unintentional acquisition or access or use of protected health information when done in good faith, and that person does not further disclose the protected health information. This is an instance where maybe a nurse accidentally opens the wrong patient chart in the course of her authorized or his authorized duty. Viewing the PHI was unintentional and done during the course of the duties, so the exception applies. However, if the technician opened the chart to snoop, oh my goodness, we have, Britney Spears as a patient. You open the chart to snoop, that's acting deliberately and not in good faith and would make that viewing a breach. Or if the patient or the nurse, shares the PHI she accidentally saw. So accidentally, she does it in the course of her duties, accidentally sees that Britney Spears is a patient, but then goes home and says, guess who's a patient? Like gossiping, that would also be considered a breach and not covered by that unintentional acquisition. Because in that instance, they're gossiping, they're further disclosing protected health information. Another exception, inadvertent disclosure to an authorized person at the same organization. So this would be when you a person who's already authorized to access the protected health information accidentally shares it with another person at the same organization. So a provider sends the wrong patient file to a coworker. The coworker then tells the provider and deletes the email. That's kind of curing that inadvertent disclosure. It's kind of important that you get that curing, that they've deleted it, because then you have that you close that loop. But that's kind of that second exception. And then a third exception is the inability to retain the PHI. So it applies if the covered entity or business associate has a good faith belief that the unauthorized person to whom the impermissible disclosure was made would not have been able to retain the information. So an example of this would be the provider mails a summary of care to the wrong person. It's returned by the post office unopened, like it says, written across the front, wrong address, return to sender. You can tell that the envelope hasn't been opened. It's likely that the addressee didn't see the information, so the exception applies. However, if you don't get the summary of care back, or if you see that the envelope has been doctored in some way, it looks like it was ripped open and then taped shut, that's probably going to be treated as a potential breach. Now, I just want to reiterate, regardless of what you decide to make a notice of breach or not, document. It's very important to do if you decide you don't need to give notice, and then always reassessing those privacy and security practices after a breach or anytime there's a change in your practice. And so this is kind of the end of this sort of presentation, but I wanted to address some questions that I've gotten in the past, go over some questions that I've received about these issues. And so one question that I frequently get is password protection. So cell phones, laptops are almost always password protected. If a cell phone or laptop is lost, can you assume that the data is inaccessible because of that password protection? In this instance, I would say I love the idea of password protecting, but no. If the protected health information is not encrypted on the laptop or cell phone that is lost, there's still the potential that somebody could break that password, get into your laptop, your cell phone, and be able to view that protected health information. That is one of the reasons, I guess I should say, why encryption is kind of viewed as the gold standard, not required, but the gold standard for protection of that patient information. Because if it is stolen in any way, shape, or form. If the person does not have that key, there is no way they're going to be able to read it. So while yes, definitely password protect your cell phones, your laptops, etc., that won't protect you from making a breach if they are stolen, because unless that information on those devices was encrypted as well. Another question I received was, is it enough to use a texting app that provides encryption, or does the app also need to be HIPAA compliant? This is kind of a twofold question. There are some apps out there that provide end-to-end encryption, which is great. I would recommend still, even if you're using an app that has end-to-end encryption, reaching out to the developer of the app, the company that monitors the app, to see if they have a business associate agreement. HIPAA requires that any third entities, third parties that you might be working with, checking to see if they should be business associates with you and have an agreement. Most of these companies are going to have a business associate agreement. They're going to be able to send it to you. You can look at it. You can sign it over. They're very aware of the rules. They're very aware of policy, whether it be health policy, financial policy, etc. But it's definitely something that I think as a backup, even if you are using encrypted, it's never a bad idea to make sure that you have that business associate agreement with the company, the app. Google even has a business associate agreement. Another aspect of that is patients can text you whatever they want. So while HIPAA is meant to protect their information, it doesn't cover them. It covers the providers. So that's a context of when texting, maybe having a conversation with your patient about the level of detail you might put in text, that minimum necessary question we talked about earlier. It might be that the patient might text you a long diatribe in the text message, and you might respond back, thank you, we'll discuss this on such and such date, or something like that. It's just being mindful of kind of the information that you put out there versus the information that comes to you, and informing the patients about that. Another question I've gotten about cell phones and storing contacts is it kind of advisable to have patient names or just initials? I think that's going to be a personal decision. However you kind of process information. You might not even have patient contact information to call patients in your cell phone. I'm not sure. But I think the important thing is just making sure that if somebody were to steal that phone, they couldn't look at the contacts and be like, oh, this is family file, this is patient file. They're not going to be able to designate the difference between people on your phone. And really, if somebody were to steal your cell phone, the chances that that person knows, unless it is somebody who actually knows you and is stealing it for a specific purpose, that you are a provider and would potentially have contact information or protected health information on your phone, are slim. But it's still really important, I think, to make sure that when you are saving that information, you're doing it in a way that is just helpful to you, but also ensures that you're not, you don't want to say patient John Doe, patient Jane Smith, etc. It might be John Doe is enough for you to know that that's one of your patients, that sort of thing. Another question I received was, I use a third-party company to do my billing, and my patient consents to give their name to the company. Is that enough? This is another one where I love that you're doing patient-informed consent. That is great. You would also want to have a business associate agreement with that third-party company. There's two kind of aspects of that. The patient, you want to inform them of any contractors you're working with. That is part of just informed consent and doing good business. But you want to have a business associate agreement with that third-party company that does your billing. If there is a breach in that third-party company, that requires them to let you know that there's been a breach, and they have to follow HIPAA and you have to follow HIPAA. It just kind of gives everybody a backup. So it comes down to that. One of the big questions that I've gotten is penalties for a breach. And I want to kind of clarify that there are no penalties. There are no penalties specific to breach or specific to this. There are just financial penalties for HIPAA violations, which could be violations of you don't comply with one or more provisions of the privacy rule, the security rule, the breach rule. Violations can be deliberate or unintentional. Like an unintentional one, you maybe give more information than you need to. You kind of violate that minimum necessary. You give out 10 years of records when they only ask for 1 year. Deliberate kind of a violation would be delaying maybe the issue of a breach notification letter, or taking longer than the 60 days to issue that notification. Penalties from HHS and the Office of Civil Rights, which kind of helps follow up on these sort of things, are going to be tiered. And they look at all aspects of the violation as well as the seriousness of the violation. So penalties, I guess, for want of another word, could range from just working with the Office of Civil Rights to address violations in your office, to change it, sort of like a technical guidance sort of thing. They might put you on a plan. Okay, you have 6 months to do this, and we want you to fix this and show us how you fixed it, and etc. Two more serious, where they might want to send a message. They have 4 tiers of kind of ways that they would come up with these penalties. They generally prefer, from what I can tell, they do prefer to do that non-punitively. You know, voluntarily complying. You're going to voluntarily comply with the rules and kind of help fix the practice, because I think they realize that for a lot of providers, there's this lack of knowledge or reasonable cause. And then, but if the violations are more severe, like willful neglect, or have continued for a long time, they're going to want to send a bigger message. And so penalty fines can range from $100 to $50,000. Those are the old numbers. They're kind of changed for inflation. So I think now it's like 127. I'm sure this information is somewhere, but I don't need to get down into that level of detail. But per violation. So let's say you have a breach that impacts 5 people. You do everything you're supposed to do. And so OCR comes in and says, okay, this is great. You did your risk. We're just going to kind of follow you a little bit. We're going to provide you some guidance. A more significant one would be you have a breach that involves 5 people and you decide, nope, I'm not going to notify them. OCR comes in and says, hey, you need to notify them, and you still don't notify them. That's sort of like a willful neglect. That's going to be on the higher level, and that could be up to 50,000 per breach. So 50,000 times 5. We've seen these you know, penalties come down. A lot of them more recently that I've been seeing have been right of access, not necessarily for these breach issues and things like that. Providers that are making it difficult for patients to get access to the records are kind of where I've seen most recently. But I think it just goes to show that documentation, being open about kind of what your practice is and trying to follow those rules, you're going to be okay in most scenarios. A penalty for a breach, if you want to think of it that way, is kind of the embarrassment of having to notify the patients. There could also be that sort of personal moral penalty that you put on yourself, and kind of the implications that would have for a practice. But there could be those financial ones if you refuse to make a breach or you wait too long to make a breach. So I want to say that the penalties are not for breach, they're for any violation, and they're going to be the same across any violation across the privacy, security, or breach notification rule. And then I guess the last question that I have written down that I've gotten a few times is, can I keep that log of breaches and just look there by the end of February? And I kind of talked about this. Yes, you definitely can. Keep a log. I recommend keeping a log even if you make a notice of each breach. And maybe in that log, it's like, this is the date, the information, etc. And if you decide you're going to notify HHS or an OCR right away, put that date in there. If you're going to wait and do them all at the end of the year, make sure you put the dates when you do, but make sure that if you're doing that log and then doing them all at once, that you are making a separate report for each separate breach if you've had more than one breach. And with that, I think that kind of concludes our webinar today. I hope that this was helpful, and thank you very much.